You notice it before you say anything. The room isn't hostile. No one is judging you, at least not openly. The question is simple. The moment is ordinary. And yet, something in you tightens. Your thoughts are already moving, fast, layered, interconnected. You can see 10 angles of the conversation before anyone else finishes their sentence. You know what you could say. You even know what the right thing to say is, but your mouth stays closed. Not because you're afraid, not because you don't know, but because speaking feels expensive. You hesitate because once words leave you, they collapse complexity into something crude. Because the nuance matters. Because what you're about to say carries weight, and weight deserves precision. So, you wait. You wait for the perfect phrasing. You wait for the moment to feel safe. You wait for clarity to finish assembling itself inside you. And by the time it does, the conversation has moved on. This is the paradox that defines deep thinkers. The very intelligence that sharpened your perception is the same intelligence that taught you silence. Thinking saved you once. It protected you. It made sense of chaos. But now, it's quietly sabotaging you. Socially, professionally, relationally. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough that people mistake your depth for distance, your restraint for disinterest, your silence for absence. And the most painful part, you don't feel misunderstood because others talk over you. You feel misunderstood because no one ever hears what never gets said. To understand why deep thinkers hesitate in public, you have to understand what kind of mind they inhabit. This isn't introversion. This isn't social anxiety. This isn't a confidence problem. This is cognitive hyperprocessing combined with threat-sensitive meaning-making. Let's name what's actually happening. First, the default mode network, DMN. This is the brain network responsible for introspection, self-referential thinking, simulation, and narrative construction. Deep thinkers have an unusually active DMN. Their minds are constantly running internal models. What does this mean? What could this imply? How does this connect to everything else I know? Speaking for them isn't a reflex. It's a compression problem. Now, layer in hypervigilance. Not the jumpy kind, the subtle kind. The kind that scans emotional temperature, power dynamics, subtext. Many deep thinkers learned early, often unconsciously, that saying the wrong thing had consequences. Confusion, rejection, misinterpretation, conflict. So the nervous system adapted. Silence became regulation. Then comes intellectualization, a defense mechanism where emotion is processed through analysis rather than expression. Feelings are translated into thoughts, thoughts into systems, systems into silence. It looks like maturity. It feels like control, but neurologically, it's a freeze response disguised as wisdom. Imagine carrying a library in your head, every book cross-referenced, every idea footnoted, and being asked to respond in a sentence. Of course you hesitate. Your brain isn't slow, it's too thorough. But here's what no one tells you. The cost of this coping strategy isn't confusion, it's grief, invisible grief. The grief of thoughts never spoken, the grief of connections never formed, the grief of being present but never felt. You begin to trade authenticity for accuracy. You choose correctness over closeness. You refine yourself out of the moment. And slowly, something shifts. You stop feeling like a participant in life and start feeling like an observer of it. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. But there is another burden, quieter and just as heavy. The unlived life of the self." Deep thinkers often fear being misunderstood more than being unknown. So they make themselves smaller, clearer, simpler, until what remains is palatable but incomplete. You don't speak because you're afraid of being wrong. You don't speak because you're afraid of being flattened. And this fear infects ordinary moments. A meeting becomes a chessboard. A conversation becomes a test. A pause becomes a verdict. You rehearse internally while life keeps moving externally. And over time, this creates a painful split. The richness of your inner world versus the thinness of how you're perceived. This is the sacrifice. Belonging, bought at the cost of expression. Safety, bought at the cost of presence. By adulthood, this pattern doesn't disappear. It evolves. It becomes sophisticated. You might recognize it in these ways. You speak only when you're certain, not when you're curious, not when you're moved, only when you're airtight. You let louder, less thoughtful people define the narrative, not because they're smarter, but because they're faster. In relationships, you become the understood one who is never fully known. You listen deeply. You respond carefully. You reveal slowly, if at all. You struggle with boundaries, not because you don't know them, but because asserting them requires immediacy, and immediacy feels unsafe. Your competence is underestimated, not due to lack of ability, but lack of visibility. Internally, you live in perpetual revision, always refining, rethinking, rephrasing, rarely releasing. Here's the truth you need to hear. These are not personality traits. They are coping strategies, and coping strategies are context-specific. What protected you once may now be limiting you. The first step isn't confidence, it's witnessing. Stop gaslighting yourself by calling this just how I am. Notice the pattern without judging it. Notice how silence feels safer than misrepresentation. Notice how thinking replaces risking. Notice how control replaces connection. Awareness is the beginning of unlearning. 5. The healing, conclusion, and affirmation. Healing doesn't mean becoming louder, it means becoming truer. The work is not to kill your depth, but to stop hiding behind it. Practices like inner child reparenting teach the nervous system that expression no longer equals danger. Shadow work helps reclaim the parts of you that learn to disappear to survive. Choosing softness, imperfect, unfinished, real, becomes an act of courage. You practice speaking before you're ready. You allow yourself to be approximate. You tolerate being misunderstood long enough to be known. This is not recklessness, it's integration. The philosopher Martin Buber wrote, "All real living is meeting," and meeting requires presence, not perfection. You don't need to abandon your thinking. You need to trust that your voice can carry it. The goal was never to be fixed. The goal is to be whole. If this resonated, it's because you recognized yourself not as broken, but as over-adapted, and now, finally, allowed to come back. Share this with someone who thinks deeply but stays silent. And if you want more work like this, subscribe, not to become someone else, but to stop disappearing from your own life.